Welcome to Some Stutter Luh.
Newfoundland and Labrador's first podcast about communicating differently.
And my name is Greg. Welcome to Some Stutter Luh, and I'm going to be using my stretch syllable target this morning to help me manage my severe stutter.
Greg, tell us about your speech targets.
The speech targets I'm going to be using this morning, this is through my Fluency Plus program, which I learned at the Speech and Stuttering in Toronto a number of years ago. It helps me to manage my severe stutter. The advantage is, one thing about this program, the Fluency Plus program, they stress that there's no cure for stuttering. It helps me to manage my stuttering. So, and the challenge I have, sometimes I get so involved in my discussion, depending on if I'm tired or if I'm emotionally involved in the conversation, which is quite evident sometimes through my primary and secondary characteristics. I really have to concentrate on both the speech targets. So today I'm going to be focusing my full breath and my stretch syllable.
Can you talk us through what you're actually doing? Like say a sentence, because that whole like stretch of you speaking was completely fluent. Like it was very, very fluent. So what are you doing? Like, are there some techniques?
What I'm doing is I'm really concentrating. I'm sort of the stretch syllable target. That is the foundation, because once I slow it down, when I'm talking in a sentence like, "How are you, Paul?" It really sort of helps me to monitor myself, and I can anticipate if I'm going to run into a problem like block, repetition, or prolongation. So I really have to concentrate. And then, so once I'm more comfortable with this target, and we can sort of speed the pace up to a normal speech pattern.
Okay.
But at the beginning, I have to do it very slowly. It's all part of speech practice.
Interesting. Yeah.
And I feel more relaxed.
Okay. That's really cool.
And also breathing, because people who stutter, we try to, well, I'm not painting everybody with that same paintbrush, but we try to get our words out quickly so we won't stutter and we don't breathe properly. So this morning I'm focusing on the Fluency Plus, stretch syllable, and the full breath target.
Could you teach us one?
Sure. For example, Laura. Laura. You see how I'm stretching it right out?
Stretching out the consonants, the vowels, the whole, both of the syllables. Yeah.
And like, for example, if I do the message of blocks is we're unapologetically challenging blocks.
Cool.
Now say that, Laura, really stretching it right out.
The message of blocks is that we are unapologetically challenging blocks.
So you're right, you speed it up a bit, which is good. And Paul, why don't you try it?
Yeah, okay, I'll give it a try. The message of blocks is that we are unapologetically challenging blocks.
You both are good, but there's choppy.
Oh.
There's not a flow.
Okay.
Like mine, the message of blocks is unapologetically challenging blocks. It's almost like a song.
You're phonating through the whole thing.
Correct.
Whereas Laura and I were probably devoicing when we normally have devoiced or unvoiced consonants, and or where there's a word break, we might devoice. So let me try that again with the idea that our vocal folds need to be vibrating through the whole thing. The message of blocks. Yeah, no, it's hard to
Oh,
do.
look at
Holy
that
cow.
S.
Yeah, no kidding, right?
Let me try.
Okay.
Okay. The message of blocks is that we are unapologetically challenging blocks.
Oh, that was good. That was
You
good.
see, it's that's excellent. That's a one syllable. It's a 1 second syllable. We move it up to a second and a half and 2 seconds. That's the process. But that's great, Laura. Yeah. And Paul, you did good as well.
Yeah, I could tell Laura did better because she got the voicing unapologetically, right? Um, but yeah, there's some S's
And
at the beginning, but
oh yeah, you see the S's are a fricative sound. The S
mhm,
is the it's an air sound. You have to sort of really sort of keep the vocal folds open.
mhm.
And it's like there's another target called the full articulatory movement. You open your mouth, FAM we call it, FAM, full articulatory movement.
Very cool.
You know, the Fluency Plus program, full transparency, is the only program that works. Well, I've used, I should say, for myself, and it sort of works for me.
Mm. So you were at the Canadian Stuttering Association conference this past weekend.
I was, Paul, yeah.
Did you use those techniques when you were giving your presentation?
I use the techniques constantly
Yeah.
during the presentation, and because there's a lot of syllables and consonants. Like the title of my presentation was by finding my authentic voice, I found my authentic self. I proudly declare I stutter. So that's a lot of fricatives and plosive sounds, but yeah. But I mean, as I was saying, there's no cure for stuttering. However, that speech therapy helps provide us with the targets to help us stutter easier. Because as you both, our listeners have heard me as well, that to stutter, it takes a lot of, when you're experiencing blocks, prolongations, repetition, takes a lot of physical energy. So it's a sort of what's easier, the speech targets to help you stutter easier. However, now one has to be very careful, and this is a discussion at the conference as well, because a number of people they've tried therapy, it hasn't worked, and they're overt stutterers. And this brings them changing the topics
No, I was going to ask about this.
slightly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm changing the topic slightly. During some Stutter Luh, I often ask the question to my guests who stutter, are you a confident stutterer? Initially, before I became so involved in the stuttering community here in Newfoundland, I would never even ask that question. And I've shared this at my presentation, that I didn't think there was any such thing as a confident stutterer. A confident stutterer. But when all is said and done, whether you take speech therapy or not, you've chosen not to take speech therapy, as long as you feel comfortable and confident to speak to whoever you want, whenever you want, and whoever you want, that to me is a definition of a confident stutterer.
Mm-hmm.
As long as you don't mask your stuttering.
Right.
Did you ask Daniel Allen Cox that question?
I did. I did ask him, and I can't remember what he said now at the moment. I have to go back to. I asked Dan several questions. As I mentioned in our last intro, Dan was very transparent, and I asked him the $64 question here. Why did you write this book? And do you feel better emotionally and psychologically because of it, for example? And he was, the reason why he wrote the book is almost like it's a healing, a healing. Dan, he, it's much like why I wrote my book as well. I wanted to find out what happened in my life and why it happened in my life. And Dan, as you know, was a member of the Jehovah's Witnesses, and eventually, when he came out, was identified as being homosexual. That's when he was shunned, and there's a lot of emotional and psychological challenges, and there's a lot of let's say Dan fell into a darkness throughout his life once he was shunned and left, which continues to today. But he's been really successful, with putting himself back together. So it's a fascinating interview conversation because Dan went from a practicing Jehovah's witness to preaching to alcohol and drugs, and he also became a nude model, and became involved in the homosexual world of sex and drugs. But he pulled himself out of it, and now he's written this book, and he is working with other people who are also ex-Jehovah's Witnesses. Because when somebody is shunned from the JFW, it's a psychological upheat. Plus, even when you're a person who stutters as well. So I highly recommend listening to the whole conversation, but also reading his book as well. I felt the end before it came. Daniel Allen Cox. So.
All right. This sounds like a great opportunity to hear it right from Daniel's own mouth. Let's go to a clip of the interview that Greg did with Daniel Allen Cox a couple weeks ago, and then we'll come back and have a chat about what we heard.
Welcome, Daniel, to Some Stutter Luh.
Thank you.
Today, I will be having a conversation with him about his recently published book, I Felt the End Before It Came, Memoirs of a Queer Ex-Jehovah's Witness. Now, first of all, Daniel, there is so much to talk about your book, I'm telling you. Yeah. And so I think we may need as a sort of another part 2 or 3 conversation about this, your book.
Yes, and there's also much to talk about in your bio as well. I need to start using, if you permit me, professional stutterer in my own bio as well. That's a fantastic point of view I hadn't considered using before.
You're more than welcome to use whatever you want. Yeah. Thank you so very much for writing this book.
Of course.
Now,
your comments are very generous, Greg. I appreciate that.
Oh, you're welcome. So as I was saying, I have a number of questions here. We only have about an hour to chat, but I was saying that in my head there's so many more questions. But I'll start with the first one. Daniel, your book is a powerful, sorrow-filled, and yet a positive, emotionally uplifting read, and a must-reread book. I praise and applaud you for having the fortitude, courage, and strength to write your memoir. First of all, why did you decide to write I Felt the End Before It Came, Memoirs as a Queer Ex-Jehovah's Witness?
Yes, well, I think in my case, it was a question of avoiding the material for several years. I'd say for like as long as I've been a writer. I've been writing since 2003, and I started off writing fiction, and my fiction was, centered around characters with a lot of different backgrounds and experiences, and not just my own. And so few of those characters have had religion in their background, and only 2 of them have mentioned Jehovah's Witnesses. 2 of the books have mentioned Jehovah's Witnesses, and published 5 fiction books prior to I Felt the End before it came. So for me, the act of avoiding that kind of reminded me of the different types of avoidance I would do as a person who stutters, right? So you mentioned it very clearly in your intro about the block, right? And just like refusing to um, be stigmatized by the block, and so I had to uh, confront my own blocks of writing, which was addressing this childhood indoctrination, and that also came hand in hand with addressing speech and how certain high control groups regulate the speech of their membership to 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 better control them. And we can talk a bit more about that if you like. I'm happy to now, if you like. I mean, um,
Oh, sure.
sure.
Feel free.
So thank you. So Jehovah's Witnesses have, I'm sure as you know, and as our listeners know, their own literature, and there's a governing body of men, right, who, of course, who determine what we read. Um, and this is their own interpretation of the Bible and their own interpretation of world events, which are often very disconnected from reality. And that comes with a very specific language, a lexicon. And that lexicon is a type of a jargon, right? So many different organizations use jargon um, in order to um, um, identify who is in versus who is out. And so if you speak the jargon well, it means that you're part of the group. If you don't, then they can identify you as an outsider, as somebody to either be wary of or to be converted. And the jargon also is a way to frame things on their own terms and to create a sense of belonging. Like, hey, these other people speak like me, right? And so I was in a group um, who spoke like me in terms of our vocabulary, but not in terms of my speech, right? And um, so there was a sense of belonging, but there was also a kind of othering that was happening. And I just wanted to talk about all this in my book. It was time to write a memoir. I think I had always written very autobiographical fiction, but I'd never tackled these subjects head on in a memoir style.
Thank you. What has been the reactions to your book, from the Jehovah's Witness, ex-Jehovah's Witness, family and friends, and general public since publishing your
Oh my
book?
goodness.
What has the reaction to
Yeah,
response?
it's been very intense, right? It's been overwhelmingly positive, and so immediately, and even before the book came out, when we'd done some pre-publication promotion, I heard from like a lot of ex-Jehovah's Witnesses in Canada, Montreal, in the US, in the UK, and elsewhere, who were getting in touch, right? And it's a very disparate community, I found, and it's also very large, right? Because it's a group who expels a lot of people for um,
Mm.
for breaking their various moral codes, and so there are ostensibly millions of people out there, or at least hundreds of thousands, who have been kicked out of the group, and who don't all keep in touch. And so once we hear about one another, we kind of latch on and try to learn more, right? Uh, to commiserate or to celebrate, I think, in some cases. Um,
Mm.
and so people what I didn't realize, Greg, about writing a memoir is that the format inspires people to tell you their stories. It inspires them to volunteer parts of their family life, parts of their work life, and their personal lives in a way that can be very intense at times, right? And so I've heard a lot of trauma. I've heard of other um, um, queer ex-Jehovah's Witnesses. I've heard from Mormons. I've heard from people in different cults. I've heard from Catholics who said, you know what, we have a lot in common. um, yeah, yeah. And I think I suspected that, but having it confirmed by readers and listeners was a very good thing for me. And um, then I also, yes, I heard from the Jehovah's Witnesses themselves as well. When I published an essay in The Guardian the day after my book came out, I heard, well, The Guardian actually heard from the UK headquarters of Jehovah's Witnesses, who objected to several points in my essay and asked me to provide proof, which we did, of course. But it was a nerve-wracking time, to have that scrutiny on the day, on the week that my book came out. But we got through it, and the support has been overwhelming. I've also heard a lot from people who stutter, and at one of these events I met one of your previous guests, Geneviève Lamoureux. Right? Yeah, and very
it's a small world.
and we've become friends, right, through connecting around talking about stuttering.
Excellent. Danielle, do you consider yourself a casualty, a survivor of both of the Jehovah's Witnesses? And can you elaborate on either or both?
Sure.
I mean, this is a $64 question.
Yes. Yeah, and it's a question I've asked myself multiple times. Well, one of the stories of how the book came to be was that I considered this matter closed and done with years ago, because I left in the 1990s, and after that happened, I considered this, or I felt I had completely moved on, and left the group in like a definitive way. And it's only in analyzing all of my behaviors and the events in my life of the past 25 years when I realized, no, I've never properly dealt with this before. I've never analyzed how the doctrines shape my personality, my worldviews, my fears, how I define the future, how I define love, right? So I've never really done that work until now, I feel. And so it was a project to continue untangling those threads. So ironically, I don't really use the words casualty nor survivor when describing that, but I think survivor is closer to that, right? And when I think about the word survivor, I think about friends of mine who died, ex-Jehovah's Witnesses who, after being shunned by their family, which is one of the practices of Jehovah's Witnesses, is that if you break the rules, you are shunned until you repent. Two of my friends turned to substance use to deal with the consequences of that, and they did not survive that. So it's in the context of their lives, Greg, that the word survivor comes into my vocabulary.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, in your book, you discuss Jehovah's Witnesses being either occult or cultish. You distinguish the difference that Jehovah's Witness is a cult based on your stance on education. It's as if, as you mentioned in your book, Daniel, that that the Jehovah's Witnesses fears awareness outside of the group or incomplete, must have something or many things to fear and hide. Can you tell us more on this for our listeners? The
For sure.
difference, culty, occult, and
Sure.
cultist.
I think there's been a lot of wrangling in in recent years as to what defines a cult, and so obviously there are check boxes that different groups and sociologists and psychologists and anti-cult experts have come to agree on, and none of those are really consistent, right? And so there can be slight differences, but one thing that is common, I think, among people who are attempting to define cult is the control of information, right? And the witnesses don't usually do it in a very covert way. And so, for example, um, in the group, we could watch television, we could read newspapers, books, go to the public library, all that stuff. Watch Netflix. Well, I assume now they can watch Netflix. We didn't have Netflix at the time. Um, um, but the commandment is to avoid certain types of material, and so um, anything uh, that veers into religion, um, anything that glorifies parts of the world over God, right? Um, anything that is vaguely satanic or inspired of demons. Now, what constitutes that? It's hard to define, but uh, they actually pinpointed several types of music, several types of cultural figures that they called demonized, right? Satanic. Um, and so they basically controlled what we consumed through these labels. But there was a very specific way that they inhibited learning and research, and that was by discouraging people from going to university after high school. And so I heard all growing up that there's no point in going to university because Armageddon is going to be coming any day now. Um, and then when Armageddon comes and all the bad people die, bad people meaning anyone who isn't a Jehovah's Witness, uh, then we're not going to need scholarly knowledge. All we'll need is godly knowledge, or carpentry skills, or gardening skills, or all the trades, right? How to turn the earth into a physical
Mm.
paradise. And so we're told, what's the point in going to school? So uh, partially through this influence, and also partially through other influence, which was my even like my own laziness, I think. I didn't attend school, and I I didn't immediately go to university. I was also looking to experience an adolescence I had never really had, right? Having been raised a preacher boy, right? So I was
Mm.
very much, as a 13-year-old, I would be knocking on doors, telling my neighbors that they're going to die unless they take my Watchtower magazine, right? And so this kind, this kind of seriousness doesn't really like allow an adolescence. And so when I left the group, I was technically an adult, but I had not yet done all the teenager things, which I then did. uh, so that's like another reason how people in the group are not prepared for learning in that way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know, along the same lines, Danielle. Like you identify the concern about the Jehovah's Witnesses lost opportunities because of their their cult base is stance on education. As you just stated, that the stance on education is similar to how you described your stepfather as 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 a literate, book shaming stepfather. Can you elaborate more on this? I mean, the lost opportunities of the members because of this
Sure.
stance.
Yes. I mean, there was a study in 2016 that showed Jehovah's Witnesses have a 9% university graduation rate. And so, like, 9% of them have an undergraduate degree. That's a lot lower than what we can call general population, I think. So that leads to loss of income, right? It leads to, especially those of us that were more bookishly inclined. I I sometimes wonder if I'd gone to university in my 20s, if I would have had the credentials I need to do the kind of teaching I want to do today, right? Um, and I see different versions of myself, who I can still attain, of course. I've actually gone back to school now, Greg, to kind of pursue those dreams. Yeah,
Oh, great.
it's important to me, and people have told me, oh, you wouldn't have appreciated school in your early 20s anyway, so you haven't lost anything, which is a great point of view. I also agree.
It is.
I
It is
also
definitely.
I can also see it, that now I do all the readings, even ones which are not required. I'm always on time for class, so I'm kind of a keener student, to the great annoyance of my professors. Um, but yeah, I do it now for the pleasure, but also for the opportunities. There are still opportunities out there. I feel that lie beyond um, getting a degree.
Mhm. Definitely, Danielle. Uh, Growing up as a Jehovah's Witness, as as an adolescent, and as an adult, am I correct? Having read your book, that that your lived experience echoes trauma experience then, and that you continue to struggle with the effects of this trauma today. I've referenced the repercussions of being shunned by the Jehovah's Witness, and can you elaborate a little more on what being shunned is?
Sure. Um, so the process is as follows: the member of the congregation has to have committed a sin, and someone has to have known about it, right? And so the sins are usually sexual in nature. They are adultery, sex before marriage, anything gay, right? So homosexuality is the official term that they use. Smoking, doing drugs, um, talking bad about the witnesses or about God, which is a serious sin of apostasy, and so these are all things that can convene you before what's called a judicial committee, and it's a group of like 3 or 4 elders, usually 3, who meet and talk with you and say, okay, here's what we've found out about you, and here's why it's wrong, and how do you plan to remedy this, or are you repentant? If you're repentant, um, sometimes no further discipline is taken. Sometimes it could be like a light discipline, like they announce to the congregation publicly, during one of their weekly meetings, which is 5 weekly meetings on 3 different nights. They may announce publicly what you did, just as a kind of a shaming, right? Um, which, of course, doesn't help anybody. um, Many groups have tried this. It's never results in anything good. And if they determine that you're not repentant enough, um, the next step is usually what's called disfellowshipping. It's very Lord of the Rings language here, Greg. I'm trying not to sound like a science fiction writer here, but it's called disfellowshipping, right? Where nobody in the congregation can speak to you for a year. That includes often the people who you live with, under except for certain exceptions, right? Such as if it's about functions like, hey, can I do your laundry, or are you having dinner tonight? And so the very functional stuff. Otherwise, there is to be like no communication, even sometimes with the parents who you're living with. Um, so it's a complete social castigation. The disfellowshipped person can attend meetings at our places of worship, which is called the Kingdom Hall. I'm sure they're all over Newfoundland and Labrador. Yeah, and they, they're encouraged to keep on attending meetings, but at the meetings, no one can actually speak to them, and so they usually come in right before it starts and they leave as soon as it's over, just to avoid the awkwardness of others having to look at them and make eye contact but not say anything. So the point is to humiliate, and how they phrase it is that, well, this is a, a loving provision, right? Because um, we can't wait to welcome you back with open arms, and we can't wait to speak to you, and we can't wait to invite you to all of our parties. But if only you would just obey the rules, and then you can run back into Jehovah's loving arms and get all of his warmth and all of our spiritual blessings. And so it's framed in that way, but as I've like described it to you, Greg, you can hear that it's cruelty, right? um, yeah.
Definitely.
So I think a lot of us who've left under circumstances like that. My case was actually a bit different. So I disassociated, which meant that I left before they could take that kind of action against me, right? Um, but I'm
Okay.
avoided all the same, all the same ways, right? It's a voluntary removal, and then that person is also to be shunned. So I think a lot of us who've left Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons and other groups like that, we often tend to brush it off and say, "Oh, I was drifting out of it anyways," or "It wasn't for me," or "I quickly found other friends, and didn't really matter. It wasn't really like a big deal," or "I didn't get along with my parents anyhow." And so we have all of these excuses um, around why it's not a traumatic thing. But if we sit down, if we take the time, if we hear other people's traumas and how they were cut off, maybe not for religious reasons, but for reasons um, that only their family morality can explain or account for, then you see the pattern. You see, oh, I see that they are a very damaged person, and I know who damaged them. And then you think, okay, well, maybe I'm damaged too, uh, even though this is now 25 years in the past, and in my case, 30 years in the past, but I'm still, or I'm just now dealing with the consequences.
And we're back. That's part one of the interview between Greg and Daniel Allen Cox. And what an interview it was, Greg. You're right about the tough questions you brought up, and he didn't seem to shy away from any of them. He handled them all as if he was being quite open and wanted to share with all of our listeners. Um, were there any particular questions that you noticed or that you asked and you were surprised by his answers?
Mm. I feel, Paul, that all the questions I asked were quite hard questions, and I really appreciated Daniel sort of being so transparent and honest. I asked Daniel questions such as if he considers himself a survivor or a casualty of being a Jehovah's
Mm-hmm.
Witness. And I asked him a question about, by writing this book, was it a cathartic uh, reason, and how he felt,
Mm-hmm.
and how his journey of being shunning. I think one of the most important questions was, does he still struggle with the impact of being shunned
Mm-hmm.
in the as a Jehovah's Witness?
Mm-hmm.
And he feels that he still struggles with it to this day, and which is understandable.
Right,
But
right,
he was so transparent, and I learned a lot
right.
from this conversation.
And being shunned, um, um, in the Jehovah's Witness community. Um, added to that is he's a person who stutters. So the role of language in the in his community was interesting, and he mentioned I think at one point he was talking about how language was a way to control information. Um, so I'm just wondering to what extent, and he didn't get into it a whole lot, but like what is his relationship with language as a person who stutters, um, coming from a Jehovah's Witness
Hmm.
upbringing? Um, did I mean it's all about language
Hmm.
when
Hmm.
when you're going door to door, um, um, uh, preaching and trying to convert folks. So I wonder how he managed with his stutter. Was there an element of being shunned um, early on, or was stuttering um, accepted or adapted into his identity as a member of Jehovah's Witness?
He
Hmm.
must be like
Um,
just a very courageous person
mm-hmm,
to confront all that and to be willing to shine a light on it and and to put himself out there in the public eye, like open for like not just acclaim from people like us. I really appreciate what he's doing, but
mm-hmm,
potential criticism from former family members, friends, in-group members, members of the Jehovah's Witness community who might not like the things he has to say.
Yeah, for sure.
That's really powerful.
And Daniel shared a lot about his challenges with his stuttering, the dogma that the Jehovah's Witnesses preach, and as he felt in many ways once he matured, and he said that it was a form of brainwashing as a part of a cult sort of thing. But he talks about all these issues in this conversation interview.
And we will hear more of that interview, the second half of that interview, in 2 weeks' time. So we hope our listeners and audience members will come back and join us for that second half.
Absolutely. And in the meantime, if you love this episode, you can check out the other 2 episodes that we've already released this season with Richard Holmes as the guest, and a backlog of 5 other seasons of interviews with lots of very interesting folks who have given so freely of their time to come on Some Stutter Luh.
To close off, we really appreciate if our listeners would share our episodes, because the more likes and shares we get, better it gets our message out, and it also increases our following.
And subscribe. Subscribe's good too.
Yep.
And
subscribe. Share, and subscribe. Do all those things to let YouTube know that you think this content is as important as we do.
Thank you very much. And a special shout out to Daniel for taking the time to chat with me.
See you next time.
See you next time.
See you next time.